we're recording. Let me just introduce you. This is the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project. This is Tim Holeman. My name is Hannah Nordhaus. It's September 22nd, 2003, and we're at the Broomfield Municipal Building, Municipal Center. And we're recording. So, I guess, let me just ask you first how you first learned about Rocky Flats.
Well, I moved here in 1981 and immediately heard about it through some of the news stories, and as somebody who's been involved in environmental issues over the years, I became interested in Rocky Flats just as a citizen, and I even participated in one of the encirclements back in the early 80s because I have always been concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons. Since that time, I ended up going to work for Governor Roy Romer, the governor of Colorado, who was elected in 1986, and came on board as a policy advisor specializing in environmental issues. At the time, I was new, and one day one of the senior aides handed me a file and said, "This is Rocky Flats, start paying attention." And the rest is history. I became deeply involved in the issue over the course of 5 years with the governor, because a number of important things happened at the plant during his tenure.
Maybe we can backpedal a little bit and you just tell me how you became an expert in environmental policy issues specifically.
Well, I had a lot of on-the-job training. I have a master's degree in public policy from CU Denver, and I've always, as a citizen, been involved in environmental issues. I don't have a degree of any sort in environmental issues, but because of my level of interest and some degree of knowledge about hazardous waste and surplus sites, the governor's office decided I should be the lead person on matters regarding Rocky Flats.
And CERCLA is?
Oh, I can't even tell you what it stands for. It's a Superfund law. I forget what the acronym even spells out.
A is ACT.
Yeah, A is ACT. And then there's also RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. Those are the two principal acts that came to bear on Rocky Flats.
And maybe you can, for our museum attendees or people who don't know, explain how they would have come to bear on Rocky Flats.
Well, that was one of the more interesting aspects of the plant. The plant operated under a veil of secrecy for a number of years, and pretty much gave short shrift to environmental laws. As we all know, under Rockwell and Dow, they buried a lot of waste, mishandled it, and eventually the state of Colorado became more and more interested in the 80s, as well as the EPA, and said, we need to start monitoring exactly what you're doing with your waste, what your water is doing. We have two major drainages that run through Rocky Flats, so our Water Quality Control Commission became involved as well, and then air quality. So there were really three areas that the state started to focus on in the mid-80s: water, air quality, and waste management. When we came to office in '87, a great deal of interest was generated when Rockwell, the contractor, then decided to incinerate low-level nuclear waste, and they built themselves an incinerator and said, "This is how we're going to manage low-level waste." Well, there was a real outcry by local citizens saying, "We don't want any more waste burnt out at Rocky Flats." They've already been processing it and releasing it through the 700 buildings. So at the time, the governor's office got a lot of citizen input saying, "Stop this incinerator." And the governor, in cooperation with Congressman David Skaggs, set up a scientific panel to see whether or not this incinerator was the right thing to do. And they eventually got the incinerator built to the point where they could do a test burn, and they were just going to burn garbage. Well, on their first try at it, they ended up blowing out the window of the incinerator and caught a fire. And that put an end to the low-level waste concept of incineration. That really elevated our interest when we realized that Rockwell wasn't quite sure what it was doing. And we became more distrustful that they were managing waste in the right way. And the incinerator fiasco really helped elevate our level of interest. And that's when our health department, along with EPA, started getting more involved and asking for much more information from the plant. So that was a pretty important point. Secondly, back in 1988, they were hoping to open the waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico, but they couldn't get it permitted by the state of New Mexico or the EPA. And for years, transuranic waste was being shipped by rail up to Idaho, the Idaho National Labs facility. And at the time, Cecil Andrus became fed up with them becoming the backyard for Rocky Flats waste. And on one Friday afternoon, Andrus, who had been threatening the Department of Energy, saying, "I've had it with this waste coming my way, you need to get the WIPP site open." Well, he stopped a train at his border and said, "Turn it around, DOE, you're going back to Rocky Flats. And we've had it with waste storage here." Well, that became a serious crisis for us. In fact, the DOE called me Friday afternoon and said, "Guess what? We've got a train here at the Idaho border, and they won't let us in. Would you guys mind having the waste come back to Rocky Flats?" So I went and talked to the governor, and he knew that we, now suddenly had a national crisis on our hands, and he accepted the boxcars back. We didn't want to see waste out there like a floating barge, stranded, and we agreed to take the waste back. But what we then said was, we're not going to be seeing waste pile up here at Rocky Flats forever. We need to respect our current what they call RCRA Part B permit, and we're only going to allow you, and the number came out to 1,601 cubic yards of waste. And when you reach that limit, then you've got to either stop production or find something else to do with the waste. We really were very nervous about us becoming the relief valve for DOE. Well, that threw DOE into a real panic. They knew they needed to keep processing plutonium, and at the time they were processing it for refitting the Trident missiles, I believe. The weapon was called the W-88, and the Secretary of Energy, Admiral James Watkins, at the time, made some personal appeals to our office saying, we really need Rocky Flats to be able to store more waste. Well, the governor prudently used his political power and said, no, this is the limit, this is your permit, find something else to do with it. Well, that prompted more and more people to get involved with the WIPP project. And the WIPP project was at a standstill. They had constructed the hole in the ground in these salt caves, and they just couldn't find a way to get it open. In fact, WIPP only eventually opened in the late 1990s, I believe. It took them another 10 years. So DOE kept producing waste, but they found ways to minimize their waste, and the permit was in place, and we stuck to our guns, and that forced DOE to start thinking of other, better ways to manage their waste and to minimize it. They even tried to build a compactor for waste, but that never worked out. So with that was another area that launched the governor into getting very involved in Rocky Flats, and he took a close personal interest in the project. Traveled down to the WIPP site to see it. We traveled up to Idaho. We had a coalition of governors, Idaho, Colorado, and New Mexico, that started to put more pressure on the DOE to open the WIPP site. We thought it could be managed safely, and we thought that they could transport the waste with the TruPack vehicle safely. And we did not want to see Rocky Flats become a storage site of last resort. Well, that action continued to play out until 1989, when the FBI raided the plant. And that changed everything. It was a dramatic event and a bold move by the Justice Department and EPA. As a matter of fact, it was kept secret from the governor until the morning when the FBI agents showed up at Rocky Flats. We hastily had a meeting that the Deputy Secretary of Energy and the U.S. Attorney attended, where they informed Governor Romer of the raid, and it immediately made, you know, front page news. You know, what were we doing with 100 FBI agents armed, raiding a fellow federal partner? It was an odd thing to have somebody like the EPA, you know, forcefully entering a nuclear weapons plant. Well, there was a great citizen outcry as well, calling for the plant to be shut down, and we also said, you know, we need to take stock of this, and that's where the state of Colorado really inserted itself into regulatory oversight of the plant. We got in the back room with DOE and we said, listen, we need to have more personnel overseeing what you're doing in water, air, waste management, and even in nuclear safety. Now, the state of Colorado had no expertise in nuclear safety, and we called upon the Congress and the DOE to get more independent oversight of the nuclear safety issue, and they had created the Nuclear Safety Board, which had good scientific expertise about how you actually do nuclear safety. But what we did was we added personnel in the air quality monitoring arena, the water quality arena, and in waste management. And we struck a deal, a multi-million-dollar deal that was a five-year effort, giving us several $1 million a year to upgrade our personnel and to put in more water quality monitoring systems, more air quality monitoring systems, and better waste management systems. So we even got a site out at the plant where we put some of our personnel so they could be on the ground looking at the facility. And that actual agreement became a model for the nation, and DOE implemented what they called the agreement in principle with all the other state health departments that had nuclear weapons facilities. So we were pretty proud of that effort. We even got $5 or $7 million from DOE to do health studies, which a number of our citizens had been clamoring for years, claiming that the residual plutonium that had been released into the environment, you know, created an unknown health risk. And so we were pretty proud of the fact that we were able to implement some health studies as well. That agreement remains in place today, and the state has substantially improved its overall oversight of the plant. Then DOE began the long march to try and restart the plant, and it failed. They brought in a new contractor, EG&G, who had some nuclear expertise, and for a couple years there, they tried to find a way to restart the plant. But they could never demonstrate that they could restart safely, and the plant remained closed to this day.
And who did they need to demonstrate that to?
Well, they needed to demonstrate it to DOE Washington, and DOE in the Washington office was never quite sure that it could restart safely. They also needed to demonstrate it to the Nuclear Safety Board and to Congress and this governor. And the governor himself said, I'm not convinced that this plant is safe enough to restart. So as a result, because of all those pressures from various organizations, the plant never got restarted. And the rest is history. DOE has found other ways since then to process plutonium down at the Los Alamos plant and now at the Savannah River plant. But we were never convinced, and we're never certain that they actually knew how to produce nuclear weapons safely again. And I think that result bore out the fact that making nuclear weapons is a hazardous business, and it was an old plant, and still is. Buildings were dilapidated. They even had a building 371, which DOE also wanted to refurbish. They had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on 371 and had come out with a plan to restart 371. And we opposed it because we thought if you're going to pump a number of millions of dollars into this plant, we'll never see Rocky Flats relocated. And the governor then took a position that he wanted to see the plant relocated within 10 years. Well, we're now about 12, 13 years out, and we're looking at 2006 for having dismantled the plant. So I think we were correct in saying, you know, you can start moving the plutonium out of here and find another way to process plutonium.
Did the governor go through a shift on this, or had he not really thought about Rocky Flats much?
I don't think he had thought about it that much. He was the state treasurer before becoming governor, and so it just wasn't in his purview. The previous governor, Governor Lamb, took an interest in Rocky Flats and even set up a citizens advisory committee. But like I said, once the incinerator fiasco took place, that really turned it up a notch for us. We were unconvinced that Rockwell International knew what they were doing. And then when they brought in EG&G to restart the plant, we were unconvinced that they knew how to do waste management. So we kept a watchful eye on both Rockwell and EG&G, and it was only until the third contractor, CH2M Hill, came in that we gained a level of confidence that there was a site manager now that understood environmental restoration and waste management, and that's been borne out by some of the results we're seeing today. But the governor really elevated his interest. He became expert in waste management issues. I'm his staff person, so I'm supposed to know more than he does. Well, he outshined me at times. He became very familiar with how you make nuclear weapons. I went and got a Q clearance, one of the top secret clearances that you need in order to be given information that affects national security. So our office became deeply engrossed in Rocky Flats, and the governor utilized his political power to convince Admiral Watkins and others that they needed to shut down the plant for good and move it off-site.
When did he reach that conclusion?
Well, we reached the conclusion that this was no place to have a nuclear weapons plant early on. Hydrologically and geologically and demographically, it was too close to water supplies. Air quality drifted into our communities. They already had a track record of bad waste management, and we said to ourselves during the 371 debate, you know, if these folks keep pumping millions of dollars into this plant, we'll never see them leave. And we made the conclusion during that debate that they should not reinvest in 371, and that this plant needed to be phased out over time. And the governor became a staunch opponent to having the plant refurbished. And I think that played a significant role with DOE Washington and with the U.S. Congress. In fact, the governor went back and testified before John Glynn's committee and called on them to relocate Rocky Flats. And he also took a political position about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We sent a letter to the president during the encirclement of Rocky Flats in 1989 that called for them to accelerate their multilateral negotiations on the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So he took a position about safety at the plant first, but then took a position about making more nuclear weapons. And as we all know, we have thousands of them, and it's not quite clear what level of safety they're providing for us today.
What specifically did they want to do in Building 371?
Well, let me try and remember. It was a plutonium reprocessing facility. They had built the plant. It was a massive concrete facility, and they discovered that their process was flawed. And I'm not expert enough to tell you what exactly was wrong with the process. They didn't demonstrate earthquake safety. They were never able to demonstrate that the plant could survive an earthquake. So they were going to go in and have to shore up some of the structural foundation of the facility and also rehab the processing line. That's about all I can tell you on that. But we said they wanted to pump $400 million into it, and we said that's insane. So because of that, we took the position don't refurbish 371 and start phasing out your operations.
Tell me what it was like to get Q clearance.
Well, that was interesting because I've lived in a lot of places, and I had to write down everywhere I had lived all the way from childhood. So I didn't even have some of the old addresses I lived at. There was one summer I actually built a home up in the Catskills of New York. I was a solar builder at the time, and I lived in a tent, and I had to tell them exactly where I lived next to what rock and what tree. They asked me a lot about my personal life and whether or not I was somebody who had any suspect background, and they asked you a lot of personal questions. It was awkward, but I received the Q clearance, and I'm glad I did, because I was able to then get more information from the DOE about what the urgency was for making more nuclear pits. And at the time, as I said, they really wanted to upgrade the Trident system with the W-88s, and that was where they were very nervous that they weren't going to be able to continue meeting that allocation. So I was glad I got the Q clearance.
Did it convince you, I don't know if you can talk about this, but did it convince you that it wasn't as urgent as they were making it?
We were never convinced that it was that urgent. No, not at all. But the Department of Energy and the Defense Department thought otherwise. And I certainly wasn't privy to all the national security issues, but I was privy enough to become convinced that there wasn't a crisis.
Did you have a difficulty getting the information you needed from DOE, Rocky Flats, the contractors to make those decisions?
Well, at first, yeah. They in 1987, they still operated under a pretty significant veil of secrecy, and Rockwell, as the contractor, was somewhat reluctant to cooperate with the state of Colorado. After the incinerator incident, and then, of course, the shutdown, DOE dramatically changed its culture, or tried to dramatically change its culture of safety by saying we're open, our doors are now transparent, we need to tell you everything we're doing about waste management and air quality. So the raid on Rocky Flats was a transforming event for the Department of Energy, which until that time had been pretty slow to move on providing us with good information. They also resisted some of our regulatory powers. We believed that we should be able to regulate and oversee the residues that had been produced at Rocky Flats, which were higher level mixed waste. And the Department of Energy often invoked the Atomic Energy Act and said that those are matters of national security, that plutonium has value, you don't have any oversight for it. We eventually changed their minds on that and began to regulate residues after the raid at Rocky Flats. But DOE is a large institution with a long history, and it was a history of not sharing information with the public. We saw that, in fact, but we saw them transform themselves after the raid. And since that time, I think they've been pretty forthcoming. We had to negotiate a tri-party agreement with them between the EPA, the state of Colorado, and the DOE that put in writing once and for all what we regulated and what we didn't regulate. And that agreement is still in operation today, and it's an agreement that's typically used around the country at other federal facilities. There are still times when national security bumps into matters of waste management, but for the most part, I think we were able to accomplish much greater waste management oversight.
Did you get the sense that when Romer concluded that first that there were problems that really needed to be fixed, and then that it was not a good site for a nuclear weapons plant, what sort of power did he have in relation to the federal?
It was really political power. We learned right away that we needed to be prudent about the exercise of that political power, and we did. The governor developed a personal relationship with Admiral Watkins, and they fed off of one another and the governor used his bully pulpit to say, stop making waste if you can't do it safely, and if you can't do it within our regulatory environment. So we did have the handle of RCRA. That gave us a handle over how they produced their waste and where they put it and how they stored it in buildings, and how site staff could oversee whether it was being safely handled. But the governor utilized his political power very strongly. We were in communication with the White House on several occasions regarding the matter, closely communicated with, at the time, Senator Worth and Wayne Allard and Ben Neidars Campbell. He went to Congress and testified, and he used a good deal of capital that he had, because he had the trust of Colorado citizens at the time. He was seen as a reasonable governor who had concerns about environmental issues, and I swear there were times where there was a Rocky Flats story in the press every day. The press just really loved the Rocky Flats story, and we used that opportunity to communicate with the public that we were trying to do the right thing by overseeing the plant more rigorously.
Did you get the sense that there were limitations to that political power?
You bet. When they said, you know, we need to keep making plutonium for the W-88s, there was a limit to what we could do. We even considered the powers that the governor has with the National Guard and whether or not we would want to use those powers. But the federal government can federalize the National Guard at a moment's notice. So it was unclear whether or not we could actually stop the production of nuclear waste. So we knew there were limits to what power we had, but we had a voice and an ear in Washington through Admiral Watkins, who said, we're going to change the way we do business now, and we're going to be a better neighbor.
When did Romer contemplate using the National Guard?
Well, during the WIPP crisis, when we didn't seriously entertain the National Guard, but we reflected on it because Cecil Andrus had stopped the trains at his border and was supposedly going to use his National Guard to stop the trains. I don't think they had to do that. The DOE brought the train to a screeching halt before actually crossing the Idaho border. We talked about what we would do if they started sending more waste down to Rocky Flats from Idaho, which we were afraid they were going to start doing as well, and using Rocky Flats as the disposal site of last resort. But we talked about it briefly. We never seriously considered it because we ended up getting the cooperation from the White House and from Admiral Watkins.
Close this door up.
Sorry about that.
I noticed earlier, but it wasn't that noisy. It's interesting. Okay.
We also were very, very concerned that there was not a national commitment to opening the WIPP site. And the governor made personal trips down to the WIPP site to see for himself. But the state of New Mexico was still unconvinced that they were able to satisfy their RCRA requirements. And there were also nuclear safety boards. The Nuclear Safety Board in Washington was unconvinced at the time. And it took them 10 more years to finally get the WIPP site open and to demonstrate the safety of the transport vehicle. We pushed our congressmen and the White House to get the job done and get the WIPP site open.
Did you have any frustrations with the political or legal limitations of your work?
Well, we were frustrated about DOE's reluctance to let us regulate residues. And they used every legal argument in their power to keep us from regulating residues. I'm not sure we actually went to court on that. I can't recall. But we finally were able to get DOE to, after the raid, to agree that the residues were something that was within our purview. So there were there were legal frustrations, and the Attorney General's office was actively involved in those negotiations. We were also frustrated that we didn't have the capacity to go in and certify that nuclear processing was happening safely. That's a very limited field of experts who know about it, and most of them come from the DOE. So it's hard to get outside experts to certify nuclear safety. And a lot of citizens were saying, Governor, you have to certify to us that they can make nuclear weapons safety. And we didn't have any nuclear specialists on hand. That's why we turned to some independent authorities. This Nuclear Safety Board, we appealed to them to do more oversight at the plant. There was a point in time when DOE was worried about criticality accidents. And that's where you get too much radioactive material in a closed space or in water. It could cause a criticality. So we convened a scientific panel and brought in talent from around the nation to verify that criticality issues were not serious. So we turned to outside experts quite often because we knew that we had limited knowledge and understanding of nuclear safety. We were pleased when they brought in the new contractor EG&G. We felt they had a better track record, but in the end we became unconvinced that EG&G really understood environmental restoration and waste management. So we were much more happy when we saw CH2 Hill come in. They had a history of doing environmental and waste management, and we saw a sea change there with the expertise that they had on their staff. And one of the critical aspects of the CH2M Hill contract was they were operating under a performance objective. Before, there were no incentives being sent to the contractor to do proper environmental work. Under the new contract, they had performance objectives that related to waste management and environmental restoration. And they had budget busters in some of the incentives that said if you screw up on environmental issues, you lose some of your fee. So we suddenly saw the new contractor turn up their attention toward environmental issues because the bottom line was at stake for them. They suddenly had new incentives to do better environmental management. And in all the 40 years past, their incentive was to make nuclear weapons, regardless of the environmental implications.
Was the state involved in helping install those incentives?
Well, we weren't parties to the contract negotiations, but we made our point with DOE and with the EPA and with the whole bid process. We said we need to see performance objectives that relate to environmental management. This has now got to become an environmental site rather than a weapons production site. So we gave a strong voice to the fact that you need to have people interested in environmental safety.
You feel that, was Colorado the first state, you mentioned that a lot of these agreements were groundbreaking for other states that have nuclear facilities. Was Colorado the first state really to inject itself into the process?
Well, around the nation, I think most of the other health departments were in the same boat that we were. They were excluded from access. They weren't getting the information they needed. DOE was not putting in the money and the staff to do environmental matters better. The raid was the telling event, and when the raid came, we then put in place our own groundbreaking agreement, and then that spread to all the other DOE facilities because all the other states said, hey, we want to do that too. So yeah, we were groundbreaking when it came to state oversight.
And the raid and the publicity it generated, is that what enabled you to do that?
You bet it did. If that hadn't happened, we might still be arguing. But the raid totally changed the whole attitude on the part of the Department of Energy.
So you were not aware of the raid, but did you feel that what was going on between the state and Rockwell prior to the raid precipitated the raid in any way?
Well, what precipitated the raid was, and it's still unclear to this day because most of it's buried in the grand jury, and the grand jury information wasn't made public. There were concerns that they were trying to do midnight burns of radioactive material. There were concerns that they were switching water from ponds to ponds and trying to play shenanigans with water quality. In the end, Rockwell was only fined for not mixing its what they called pondcrete, which was low-level radioactive waste mixed with concrete. They couldn't seem to get the recipe right on how you made concrete, and that some of the concrete actually melted in rainstorms. But to this day, I am unsure who at the EPA said we're going to go do a secret raid. But they got information that told them that somebody was doing something illegal there. We were never privy to some of those whistleblowers and people who accused the DOE of doing dangerous things. And it really came as a complete surprise to us. They told us the moment the raid began. They sat in the governor's office and said, guess what? The plant's being raided. The governor was very unhappy with that. He was very unhappy at not being informed that this was about to happen. We were caught off guard. He put me in a car and said, go out to Rocky Flats and see what's going on. I drove onto the plant site, and chaos was ensuing. You know, there were agents going through records. The U.S. attorney was out there. You know, I couldn't really do much, but we wanted to make sure that we had a presence at the plant during the early hours of the raid.
Why don't you tell me what it was like? I don't know how often you went on site at the plant, but what that experience was like.
I went on site pretty regularly, especially during the waste crisis, and received tours and briefings from DOE and the contractor about how they were handling their waste. You know, it was always interesting to drive out to the site and have them check your ID and badge you and all that. And since I had gotten a Q clearance, it was much easier for me to just show my badge and get onto the site. So I had complete access to the site after I got my Q clearance, and DOE was usually very open to showing you things. I had the privilege or the curse of seeing where they stored the ingot plutonium, and that was a shock to see these little canisters sitting in, you know, an oxygen-free environment, and saying, "Oh my God, this is the heart of where all the nuclear weapons come from." And I always had that memory etched in my mind of seeing all that ingot plutonium sitting there. So once I got my clearance, I felt that I had access to the site and to information. DOE was very responsive after the raid. We had more resistance from DOE Washington, who used their legal arguments to invoke the Atomic Energy Act. There was more trouble with the legal counsel in Washington than probably any other area of DOE.
So when the ingot plutonium was in the casings?
Yeah. Yes.
And did you have to wear a protective?
Not in that area. I didn't. No, I think I had to put on overalls, but it's totally protected. So but going into other buildings, 771 and 776, you had to wear a protective suit.
Did that scare you?
Well, it certainly educated me to what kind of dangers these guys were up to. I finally got to see firsthand that you know, they were playing with fire. I saw the workers working in the glove boxes, and I thought to myself, boy, this is dangerous work. And we always were very supportive of the workers at the plant site, because they were the first line of defense. If you couldn't protect the workers, how could you protect the residents around the plant? We got to see firsthand the hazards that the workers subjected themselves to, and we were very concerned about that.
Were you concerned about your personal health and safety?
Well, you know, I was doing what they told me to do, and they would then check you with radiation detectors to see whether you'd gotten any load. So I never felt entirely at risk, but I paid attention to what they told me to do. So.
What was your overall impression of the environment at the site and the buildings and stuff?
Well, I thought it was old. Some of these buildings were just, they had waste stored in hallways and in places that they shouldn't have been storing them. These glove boxes looked old. The buildings looked a little dilapidated. I always had the impression that this is an old facility, just like a car facility. It's breaking down, and I thought, we've got to do something about that. Either improve the safety or stop doing it. But it was an old dilapidated facility.
Okay, why don't we discuss your involvement with the Broomfield and the cleanup now?
Oh, okay. Well, in 1993, I left the governor's office, I left in 91, and in 1993, the city of Broomfield hired me to oversee what they called their Option B water protection project. At the time of the raid, it was not just the state that was freaking out, it was the local units of government downstream. Broomfield had its main water supply, Great Western Reservoir, directly across the street from the buffer zone, and Walnut Creek drained right through the site and into our water supply. Years prior, there had been a tritium incident. The tritium was leaked actually into our water supply, and that elevated the level of interest on the part of our city manager, George DeCero, who's been city manager for 35 years now. They hired me to find a way for us to replace our water supply or protect it from downstream runoff. We put together a coalition of 4 cities, Broomfield on the Walnut Creek drainage, and then Westminster, North Glen, and Thornton, who had the Stanley Lake reservoir that was directly downstream from Holeman Creek. Broomfield had residual quantities of plutonium in the bottom of its reservoir. We were never quite sure whether those were safe quantities, but we certainly didn't appreciate the fact that there was plutonium in the bottom of the reservoir. It was in the sediment, and it was stable, and it wasn't moving, and we do extensive water quality testing, of course. But we were concerned that another incident was going to happen, and when the raid took place, these cities came together and said, we have to find a way to either reroute the water drainages or find a way to protect our water. Now, in the case of Broomfield, we said we want to replace Great Western Reservoir by buying water rights up on the Windy Gap project and piping the water up from the Colorado Northern Water Conservancy District. We went to Washington and lobbied the Congress to give us a total of $70 million for replacing our water supply. And through the work of Tim Wirth and Congressman Skaggs, and through our lobbying, we were able to gain appropriations over the course of several years. And as a result, we stopped using Great Western as our principal water supply, and we ended up building a pipeline from the Windy Gap project all the way down to Broomfield. So we're in a much better position today than we were 10 years ago, when through accidents and through mismanagement of the water drainage, we no longer have to worry as much about the water supply. As a matter of fact, 2 days after the raid on Rocky Flats, Broomfield dug a ditch from the entrance of the Walnut Creek drainage and dug a drainage ditch around the reservoir, and we diverted water around our reservoir, but we knew that wasn't a long-term solution. We knew we had to find a way to actually get out of using Great Western Reservoir. And we were successful in doing that. Now, that was at the time when DOE, when the checkbook was open for them, they were willing to spend the money they needed to help us. And we had to convince them, because there were a number of people within DOE that said, we don't think you're at risk. We think we've got a series of drainage holding ponds upstream that control and maintain safe releases. Well, that wasn't always the case. Quite often in the spring, during heavy rains runoff, our drainage ponds would fill up, and DOE would end up calling us and saying, we'd like to do a release from your drainage ponds prior to testing, because the safety of the dams were at risk. And every spring we had the same problem. rain a lot, the ponds would fill up, DOE would call and say, we need to do an immediate release so that the dams don't break. Well, we got tired of those shenanigans, and that's why we replaced our water supply.
And so what is your role now with Broomfield?
Well, I'm an advisor to the manager's office, and I work on transportation issues and environmental issues. And I've, over the years, have spent a lot of time working on water quality and water quantity issues regarding the plant site. We put in more monitors at the drainage ponds. We improved the testing protocols. We went down to the Water Quality Control Commission and got improvements in the number of picocuries they could release per liter. So we really ratcheted up the water quality controls, and to this day those controls are working. And Westminster, Thornton, and Northglenn have an alternative project called the Walnut Creek Reservoir, where they capture the water runoff from the flats, and they do extensive environmental testing before they release it into Stanley Lake. And they got $30 million to do their project. So all total, over almost $100 million was put into the 4 communities. And since that time, we've just sort of stayed on the back of DOE to do good water quality monitoring.
So how do you feel about the cleanup, and how has that changed?
Well, I'm pretty pleased with the direction they're going. They're actually getting stuff cleaned up. They're shipping waste off-site. We have these TruPack trucks taking waste to the WIPP project. The site is actually getting rid of waste, and it got rid of the plutonium only recently. I'm pretty pleased with that aspect. I'm not so convinced they know what they're doing with the building foundations and the cleanup of residual contamination on the grounds. We've had a 3-year battle regarding what is a safe level of plutonium to leave in the soil, and also in building foundations. It's going to cost them a lot of money to dig up foundations, and at this point in time, I think they've concluded that they can take the building rubble from the buildings they've cleaned up, get it to a low level, and fill the foundations with rubble. I don't particularly like that idea, but it might break their budget, and it might create more unsafe conditions by digging up hundreds of acres of soil. Right now the plutonium is deep in the sediment of the soil, and there are hot spots, to be sure. There are places where there are higher levels of plutonium, and we think they ought to be digging up those hot spots. There's the 903 pad, which is the result of an accident back in the 60s, and where they buried barrels of plutonium and uranium contaminated waste and then covered it with an asphalt pad. We think that pad needs to come up completely, and I'm pretty sure they're planning on doing that. So, you know, from 12 years ago, when the plant was still cranking out weapons and wanting to throw millions of dollars into refurbishing it, and we didn't know what the waste problem was, and we weren't quite sure about the levels of contamination in the soil, we've come a long way. I think the community and the department should be proud of the direction they're going. Let's hope they can figure out what to do with the foundations, though. That creates a real problem, I think.
How do you feel that your work on the Rocky Flats issue has changed you?
Well, I learned firsthand about the difficult science of nuclear energy. It's a really tough science. There's great uncertainty about what are the harmful levels that a body can take from radiation. To this day, scientists on both sides of the question debate it. So I came to appreciate the uncertainty involved in how safe is safe. It also changed me about how I view institutions like the DOE. Large federal institutions are pretty tough to move unless there's some precipitating event, that, as in this case the raid, causes them to move. They're slow to change. They're slow to change their mindset. You need to exercise prudent political power to get them to change. And so I really learned the art of politics with Rocky Flats, and how the governor would position himself to, be a leading voice for safety, and whether that was actually forcing this large ship to make a sea change toward a safety culture rather than one of making nuclear weapons. I grew to know more about nuclear weapons production than I ever care to know. And I feel I have a good working knowledge about what it takes to make a weapon, but you frankly don't need that kind of knowledge.
I wonder if you could tell me how your attitude about Rocky Flats when you were involved as a citizen encirclement, how that may have changed as you became more involved in the issue as a...
Well, when I became involved on the inside as a regulator and policy advisor, I just grew to understand that some of these questions were not as simple as I may have thought of when I was a citizen encircling the plant. We created a mess around the country. I forget how many nuclear weapons sites we actually have, but we created such a god-awful mess in all these locations. It became unclear how we were going to solve it. If we couldn't open up waste disposal sites, if we didn't know how to manage the waste, if there are uncertainties about what safe levels of air and water emissions were, all these things became more uncertain in my mind. And I grew to appreciate the difficulty about overseeing a plant like this in the middle of a metropolitan area. And I also grew to understand that it was a mistake to put it here. We were downwind from it, downstream from it. The geology and hydrology isn't right, but at the time the country wanted to make nuclear weapons, and so they picked a site near a metro area, and that was a mistake. It created a lot of jobs and a lot of economic prosperity for this community, and a lot of workers live in Broomfield and the other surrounding communities. But what a mess to clean up, and billions of dollars of taxpayer money has had to go into this plant to get it to this place that we're at now. And we're lucky we've gotten the congressional resources that we have. If Congress had not been in a mood to clean up the nuclear weapons complex, we might be having the same troubles today. I developed a network of contacts around the nation, and we actually formed our own group of states and tribal governments, and we worked as a coalition to lobby Congress for more money for all the weapons complex. And I grew very involved in what happens at the other sites as well as what happens at Rocky Flats.
I wonder if you could tell me also maybe your experience as a protester and then your perception of the protesters once you became a regulator and kind of a deal with them.
Yeah, that was interesting. We just were overwhelmed by the number of letters that we got on Rocky Flats. There was a tremendous outpouring of citizen concerns, especially during the incinerator incident, and then of course after the raid. Right after the raid, Leroy Moore of the Peace Center came and fasted on the front lawn of the Capitol for, I think it was close to 30 days. I'm not sure how long he lasted. But we could look out the window of the governor's office and see Leroy sitting out there. And it reminded us every day of how important it is to protect the citizens of the state. I thought the protest movement was very effective in elevating the level of concern about the plant, and it had an effect on the regulators. One of the criteria under CERCLA is citizen support, citizen concerns, and you need to take into account when you're doing regulation what the level of citizen concern is. And it was pretty clear that there were a large number of very vocal people who were genuinely concerned about the plant safety. And during the protest movement, which was more oriented around proliferation, there were even then many citizens who said this plant is just unsafe and we just have to move it and relocate it. But going on into the inside, I became equally convinced that the plant had to be moved. And in the end, it validated what I felt like when I was encircling the plant in the early 80s.
did you find out about the encirclement?
It was just advertised, and I followed environmental issues, was in the Sierra Club, and just knew about it, and went out with my friends and joined hands. As a matter of fact, during the last encirclement, the governor wrote a letter on behalf of the protesters to President Bush saying, you've got to start looking at ways to decrease the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And we felt that was our symbolic gesture in support of the protest movement. And we also said in that letter we want the plant relocated. I have a copy of it here, so if you want it.
Yeah.
So.
How about the workers? Did you have much contact with them?
Not as extensively as people like Congressman Skaggs and Tim Wirth did, but we were in contact with the workers, and they had their concerns too. But we had disagreements with the workforce. We felt there needed to be more oversight, more rigor in the way that their work was being handled. The workers had a number of complaints about safety, and those were issues that we weren't as familiar with, as I said, and which we called on the Nuclear Safety Board to become more involved with. The state of Colorado does not have an OSHA or a worker safety division, so we didn't have the tools to actually help the workers as much as we would have liked.
And how about, did you have a lot of contact with the sort of pro-nuclear protests?
Yeah, we did. A number of people communicated, not as strongly as the anti-nuclear folks, but we had people contacting us saying the level of safety is adequate, and we're overreacting to the problem. There were a number of workers who felt that we were doing overkill. So we had a sincere disagreement with some of them. It's noon now.
We gotta wrap up. Okay, let me just ask you, can I ask you two more questions?
Sure.
Just one, in the aftermath of the Cold War, how do you feel about the nuclear industry and issues of national security?
Well, my personal feeling is it's insane what we're doing. We've still got 8,000 nuclear weapons on our hands. We're still having to reprocess, and they're thinking about building a Rocky Flats 2 somewhere else. I am unconvinced that we need to be continuing to upgrade our nuclear capabilities, and I think the current president needs to strengthen his efforts to stop the proliferation and get agreements in place to cut back the number. We had all these great agreements where we cut back significantly, but we still have 8,000 nuclear weapons, and I feel that's a drain on the national treasury, and it's a risk to our nation and the world.
Did you encounter any criticism or harassment of the actions you took?
No. Criticism we received. A number of the people in the environmental movement felt that we weren't doing as much as we should be doing. But no, we never were harassed. They were always very civil and good conversations that we had with the environmental community.
Last question, best, worst, most interesting things about your involvement with Rocky Flats?
I'd have to say it was when I went inside one of the 700 buildings and saw all that plutonium. I'd say that was the most impacting event on me, because I saw it plain as day that we had all this stuff sitting there, and it was all about to be shipped out to nuclear submarines and warheads. And I thought, boy, this is the heart of darkness. So I was very impacted by that.
Okay. Then we'll call it a wrap.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Was that okay?
That was great.